We've been hearing today about sort of systems to manage people and manage networks. And I think there's no doubt that over the last 8 years under Mayor Ken, the traffic systems have improved, and certainly bus travel has improved quite significantly. But it makes me think of two particular issues, and one which I sort of mentioned in an informal chat outside and in an earlier seminar. The use of origin and destination material, whether it's for planning networks or monitoring networks. Makes me think of two things. One is the Oxford Street debacle, which I know we can't go into because we could take all day on that one. But the fact that in many cases 2, even 3 bus routes replaced one cross-city route which existed 10 or 15 years ago. Or secondly, on an operation like Overground, where very clearly TfL did not plan adequately the number of journeys which were likely to transfer to that route once it went onto the tube map and Oyster came in, and there is still a debacle over what's going to happen in South London. How can you improve and increase your origin and destination research to A, manage the network now, and B, plan the network better for the future?
Michelle, I think this one was...
Well, Oyster and people's existing patterns help us plan the network now. When you provide new services, then that depends on our models and how well our models can predict change in behaviours. And I think what's interesting is, we do a lot of the modelling work in TfL, and we collect all the London-wide data, residence data, about how people travel. And it seems like perhaps people's travel patterns and travel behaviours are changing. But the models are still built on the old assumptions. And what one needs to do is just get more robust hard data about how those patterns might be changing, because there's always been a sort of like a given number of trips per day that people have made over time, and what's changed is the mode by which they've made them rather than the number of trips. But people's trip-making behaviour seems to be changing, but until we've got some robust numbers to say we need to change the models, then our models still use the other assumptions. So partly it's to do with the accuracy of the modelling and predicting how people will respond to these new services. But I'm not saying that they're totally wrong, it's just that some services prove to be a lot more attractive than perhaps we would expect them to do if we're just looking at time and cost in people's decision making. And that's the interesting thing, is how can we capture some of the other things that people might be taking into account in making those decisions. Like some people might actually just do anything to avoid going into central London. They just don't want to go into central London because they don't want to go on the underground or something. So they might be more attractive to using the overground than just a time and cost equation might imply. So something that we do want to do in the surveys that we do of households is not only understand what people are doing, but do some follow-up questions as to why they're doing it. And that will better inform our work going forward.
But I urge that it's not just household surveys, but also actual passenger surveys,
Yeah.
actually talk to people on the ground, and if necessary, the dreaded focus group.
Yes.
I think this naturally leads on to Ashford, because obviously, as his biography states, he is directly involved in managing those complaints.
Yes, I have to say that I think that we have real shortcomings in transport modelling. In the rail industry, where there have been new openings of lines in recent years, demand has been substantially underestimated. The opening of the Ebbw Vale line in Wales is a particular example. And again, in the rail industry, the standard modelling systems are very heavily driven by speed and cost. And this has a number of consequences for passengers. One is that the business case is never there to relieve overcrowding, and and to put an extra carriage onto trains, which is a particular problem in the north of England. The other area where I think the modelling has a shortcoming is the sort of what's called in economics the sort of network benefits. And I think kind of Oyster is a kind of an interesting example where there was a degree of transparency and simplicity about the fare offer that came with Oyster that generated a new attitude to travel on the part of some, and that it's very difficult to capture that in modelling. And we've seen with in the latest wave of the National Passenger Survey that we do in National Rail that the open access operators, Wrexham and Shropshire and Grand Central, have very high satisfaction figures for value for money, and both have much simpler fare structures than the majority of the rail industry. But it's one thing for us to do some satisfaction surveys. It's quite another to do the analytical work that says that that sort of simplicity actually generates traffic and therefore makes a business case. And I think this really is a challenge for the transport industry as a whole, to say how can it capture the value of comfort, the value of transparency and simplicity and a clear network in terms of driving traffic. Because often transport innovations and some of the things that have been talked about today are about those things, and yet sometimes it feels like they're done on a wing and a prayer by people who've got the belief in them rather than necessarily a solid business case.
There you are, that's this year's passenger focus.
I think it naturally leads on to Errol because of in travel behaviour. So your thoughts?
Yes, we have studied the responses to intelligent transport systems and specifically to advanced travel information systems, specifically systems that provide online information to travelers. And although it might be a general assumption that by providing travelers with information, they will become more efficient in the choices they are making, they will reduce their travel times. It might happen, but on the other hand, because of sometimes being overwhelmed by amount of information, the problem is becoming so complex that there are so many different choices, and there is no simple mechanisms for human beings to calculate what are the best choices, that actually in some situations providing more information doesn't really help. You need to know what type of information, in what format you need to provide the information rather than to give a large amount of information that, yes, the answer is somewhere there, but it's really hard cognitive task for the traveler to find out where it is. So sometimes it's the design of the travel information systems that could help a lot in improving the travel patterns of individuals. And it's also becoming quite a difficult task for modelers themselves to predict behavior, because behavior is becoming more complex because of information systems available. There are changing lifestyles as well at the same time, because our behavior, travel behavior, is less routine than it used to be. It's less fixed. There are more flexibilities, less constraints. People are doing teleworking, people have flexible work hours. So it's becoming more and more difficult to predict people's behavior and specifically their responses to behavior. And I do agree that there is a need for more models and more advanced models, and this is something we are working on at the moment, I guess, yes.
Stephen, is an overview from your past experience?
Yes, all of those comments have been about getting better information to manage the network from the provider's point of view for planning and provision. And it's all very encouraging how we have ways of getting more information. But there's another dimension which I particularly welcomed from Michel's presentation, which is the work that TfL are doing to develop measures of the performance of the network from the point of view of the user. The measurement of the probability of a long delay. For 40 years or longer, we have in London and other parts of the country routinely done that for the public transport system. You know, for the bus network, we've recorded and published excess waiting time on the bus network, which is an attempt to tell the public how their service is doing from their point of view, how much longer you might have to wait at a stop than you would have to wait if the buses were running absolutely smoothly. But on the roads, until very recently, we've just not given that any attention at all. We take it for granted on the National Railway now that as a user you can go to the Office of Rail Regulation website, you can see how your service is doing, how many trains are late, and if you don't like it, you can try and hold the providers to account. But again, at the National Road Network, until very, very recently, There's been absolutely no way of doing that as a member of the general public. But we are now beginning to develop that, and I think it's an enormously important step forward. TfL's work you've heard about, the Highways Agency are producing their PSA measure, which is a start. It's nowhere near good enough yet. It doesn't really tell you what you need to know in enough detail, but it is a beginning, and I believe when we've got there, using all the ITS data we're getting, we can really get something which will allow the general public to act as a consumer of road services and hold the providers to account in return for the enormous amount of money that we pay for the use of their own network.